this is the second workshop of 2025. We had a 1 year break from workshopping, and it's great to get back on with it and to see everyone here today. Thank you so much to Rebys, especially, for coming along and doing this talk without any guarantee of a decent payment. And on that note, thank you so much to everyone who has donated via the tickets, which will go straight to Rebys. And we will also have a PayPal open. I will pop the link in chat if you would like to tip afterwards. The link has just gone in chat. We also have a Patreon, which if you would like to do like monthly payments of like a £1, $1, whatever, then that also really helps, whatever you can do. And obviously just sharing the workshops and the work that Transmuted does helps us in those hidden ways. So if you have any questions during the talk, and this will be pretty much the same but different if you're using like a tablet or a phone or a PC. If you have any questions during the talk, please use the Q&A under the Activities tab. There should be a triangle, a square, and a circle icon that you can click, and then there's Q&A. You can ask a question in there, or you can use the chat if you would like to. We just like to have it all set up neatly here so we can ask questions at the end. While Rebys is presenting the talk, until discussion at the end, please feel free to turn off your webcam. I see that everyone's got the webcam off anyway, so that's great. Just to help with the internet connection. And when we open up the floor for discussion at the end, you can obviously turn on your webcam or use the chat function whenever you want, however you feel comfortable. Yeah, I've shared the PayPal, I've shared the Patreon, always pushing for that fundraising. If you're around for another workshop, if you'd like to get into more workshops, obviously we have the emailing list, which I have to sort out some issues that we have with that, and that's great. We also have the Patreon, where these will be announced, and the Discord as well. You can join the Discord by going to our website. There's in the header and the footer, there's a join the Discord link. Yeah, so we're having the next workshop at the 8th of March at 6 p.m. London time. I think that's like 10 a.m. Pacific Central Time, Pacific Standard Time rather. So the 8th of March, we'll be hosting Alex Hayden Williams talking about trans history, specifically Chevalier d'Eon and William Brown, the Georgian era trans icons and differences of gender and transition in class systems. We will be sending out an email and posting that on all the social medias as soon as we can. We also have some more film workshops in this year, so please keep an eye out for those. Really excited to get on with those. And especially excited to host Rebys. Thank you very much for listening to all that waffle. I'll pass over to you.
Thank you very much, Dorian. And thank you everyone for coming today. Thank you for Transmuted for hosting me. Yeah, this is Being the Monster, the History and Future of the Trans Killer on Film. Just a little, 1 second, is this working? There we go. Hi, so I'm Rebys J Hynes. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a writer, film curator, and programmer based in Glasgow. I have a master's in film curation, and my master's thesis was entitled Murderers and Deceptive Bodies, an investigation into depictions of transgender killers in Titan, Possessor, and Let the Right One In. What we're doing today is going to be a breakdown of kind of the main themes of my research and kind of how I've built upon that in the years since. So we've got 3 main aims from this workshop that hopefully we'll achieve by the end. First off, we are here to contextualize one of the most explicitly transphobic tropes in film history. We're also here to understand how it shapes modern transphobia. In particular, TERF rhetoric very much heavily draws on kind of the spectre of the trans killer. And we're also here to see what we can learn about trans film history in order to inform trans film future. I just want to give kind of content warnings that, we are going to be discussing quite a lot of heavy themes throughout this workshop. There'll be discussions of transphobia and abuse throughout, child abuse specifically. These films are immensely transphobic. They perpetuate ideas of trans people as being dangerous, to be othered, and we're going to be talking about these films in a way of reclamation. Some of them, not all of them, but we can't do this without first acknowledging that transphobia runs rife through these films. And even in the films that I love and that we're going to be talking about in the most positive and reclaiming way, they're still made with transphobic intentions, and that is unavoidable. As for child abuse, we're going to be talking about the cisgender gaze and how it exists on film, and it does not discriminate based on age. And the two case studies we will be focused on will focus on trans killers who are also children and how the camera in these films treats their bodies. I will flag when we are approaching moments that will be more harsh in these discussions, but just be aware of that. If you need to take yourself off at any point, please feel free to. There will be brief descriptions of the murders of real serial killer Ed Gein. I flagged this up just to distinguish between the fictional violence and the real violence that we will be talking about, and there are passing references to sexual assault. I was at first quite hesitant to talk about this topic because it centralizes transphobia in such a vehemently transphobic time. And it's difficult to kind of talk about these films in that positive way. But when I was talking to Transmuted about doing this workshop, I really liked this quote, which Dorian said, which was, if we cannot talk about it with trans people, how can we talk about it with cis people? And I really think we should take this through into how we talk about all sorts of trans lives on film and in life, talk about it with each other. So hopefully we can then break those barriers down and talk about it beyond here. Before we go ahead, I just want to define some terms. I know we all know what gender and trans is. We are at a Transmuted workshop, but I want to be as expansive as possible with these definitions. I think that's really important when discussing trans lives on film, especially when kind of transness on film is often half existing. It's rarely made by trans people, so it's difficult to convey what is trans and what isn't. And I think we should be as expansive in our definition as possible. So gender in this workshop will be defined by a want. If a person desires to be that gender, then that's how they're treated. Gender is a choice and it is acquired in the choosing. I'm not going to ask for evidence for a gender. That's a very transmedicalist approach. And I think any character who wants to be a gender will be treated as such in this workshop. And I really like Kid Haim's definition of trans, which is movement of gender. This idea that trans in this workshop will kind of encompass just the fluidity of gender on screen. So what is the trans killer? The trans killer, as I define it, is a murderer who exhibits a transgender identity or cross-dressing tendency/deception, which is typically, but not always, intertwined with their methods and or motivation for murder. They are a twofold threat. They are murderers, and they are a threat to cis-normative ideas of gender. It must be asserted here that the trans killer is almost certainly just an invention of cinema. There aren't any trans serial killers that we know of. I'm willing to be corrected on that, but this is purely a cinematic invention. And that's one of the key things we need to know when talking about the trans killer, how much this was invented on film. It all kind of starts with Psycho. It doesn't, but Psycho popularizes it. And that's why we kind of really have to centralize Psycho. In that, killer Norman Bates, spoilers for the film of 60, 70 years old, Norman Bates adopts the alter ego of their mother when sexually aroused and the personality of their mother, Norma Bates, compels them to kill the subject of their attraction. This is revealed at the end of the film, where Norman runs in dress and kind of very much of the reveal scene. And yeah, that image has haunted trans cinema ever since. But it is not the first trans killer. It's not even the first Hitchcock trans killer. Because in Murder from 1930, we have transphobia and racism intertwined. A villainous man dresses as a woman and murders to hide the fact that he is half Indian. And then in between Murder and Psycho, we get plenty of queer killers. Queer killers have populated the cinematic history. I'm thinking like Vincent Price, and they play queer, homicidal characters, villainous and camp. But Psycho is the big one. Psycho is when it enters the cinematic language and it doesn't go away. And while the idea that Psycho is the first slasher is definitely up for debate, it's the first most popular slasher. It floods the genre, and with the invention of one of horror's most significant genres, we have this image of Norman/Norma Bates, and that lingers. We cannot talk about Psycho without talking about the real murderer, Ed Gein. Robert Bloch wrote the novel Psycho, on which the film is based, and that was heavily inspired by the real murders of serial killer and grave robber Ed Gein, who, upon his arrest in 1957, was incorrectly attributed transness by the press. 2 weeks after Gein's arrest, Life magazine ran an 8-page story in which they claimed Gein wishes he was a woman. And it was claimed by many of the press that he wanted gender reassignment surgery. At this point, Gein had yet to be formally psychoanalyzed. This was just kind of a lie that grew a lot of traction. Gein was a serial killer. The extent of his crimes is not known, and the reason that he exists across film history is because of the way in which he killed people. We don't know how many people he killed, but he kept the body parts and he would make things from them. So we have women's faces turned into masks, and there was a corset made of skin. This very much is where we get the idea of what films like Silence of the Lambs will pick up, of a skin suit, of this idea of wanting to become the mother, which Psycho very much leans into. This is all horrific things that really happened, but they're not an indication of transness. I think there's a lot of quotes from this time that very much indicate this. When the local crime lab director, Charles Wilson, was asked about Gein being trans, he said, "It's news to me." This was something that began in the press and really grew steam, and it wasn't true. In the mid-1970s, a doctor said that Gein was a frustrated transsexual and claimed that the police found Christine Jorgensen's autobiography in his house. This is one of my favorite details of this whole story, because Gein was arrested in 1957, and Christine Jorgensen's autobiography came out in 1967, 10 years after the fact. Unless Gein was a time traveler, he simply could not have had that autobiography. What this does is it shows us what people were thinking about when they saw a skin suit in the public eye. Jorgensen's very public transition changed the 1950s. Suddenly people are aware of trans people in the media in a way that they'd never been before, and an idea of transformation it was present, and that's in the eyes of a very cis-normative world that says the other is wrong. They conflated Jorgensen and Gein in a horrific way. And there was such a mass misreporting of Gein's crimes that, as K.E. Sullivan writes, even now it is difficult to sift fact from fiction. There was such an extensive lying about how Gein acted that we just don't know much about much about him. I want to highlight this biography of him, which is kind of the most comprehensive. It's not good, but it is the most comprehensive. And its subtitle refers to the original Psycho. And because Norman Bates was so famous, his narrative, their trans narrative, superseded the cis narrative of Gein. This fictional trans killer has superseded the cis killer and codified the trans killer figure. It's really important to talk about Gein and Bates, I think, because of moments like this, where we see the trans killer being used as justification for transphobia. In 1999, feminist scholar Germaine Greer wrote, "The gender reassignment is an exorcism of the mother. When a man decides to spend his life impersonating his mother, like Norman Bates in Psycho, it is as if he murders her and gets away with it." The Whole Woman is a horrible thing to read from a trans perspective. It is not fun. And this is such a fascinating moment in it because we see so much of the bones of modern transphobia just so plain in this sentence. The kind of idea that feminine men, that comes from a bad relationship with the mother. The idea that the focus on trans womanhood and the ignorance of trans masculinity, and of course the assertion that transgender women are dangerous. They're comparable to psychopaths and murderers. And Greer's evidence for this is a movie, is a fiction. You know, so this in this quote to Greer, a fictitious killer is treated as evidence that trans women are dangerous. It's mad how much Psycho lingers in the public consciousness of trans people, of trans history on film. And it does linger because this reveal, this trope, this idea of trans people killing just dominates film for the next so many decades. Some films akin to Psycho kind of employ as a twist reveal. So we have like Sleepaway Camp or Dressed to Kill. They're trans killers. It's a reveal towards the end that the killer was actually trans all along. Sometimes it's more like Silence of the Lambs, where they're just transness is visible on screen and it's villainous, and it's that simple. There are core ideas, but they do differ often. But there's often ideas of deception, sexual perversion, and a compulsion for murder. Often the deception exists within the narrative structure. As I said, it will be used as a twist. They have deceived not just the people around them, but the audience. And usually by the film's ends, the trans killer's identity and body are usually exposed. They are vanquished by cisgender killers, and they assert a cis-normativity in the film's conclusions. I'm just going to take a little note on reclaiming here. You're going to see me defending and reinterpreting some of these films across this workshop, and what films I find oddly beautiful and worth reclaiming, that's a personal thing, I think. And I'm not telling you that you should see this in them because it does vary what we can forgive and what we can find beauty in. And for example, I know a lot of trans people, and I've read some beautiful works by trans people who find they can reclaim Silence of the Lambs and find something really beautiful in the depiction of Buffalo Bill, the central trans killer of that film. And I just can't see it. But then I'll watch Sleepaway Camp and find something beautiful in the story of Angela. I want to talk about these films so we can talk about them, so we can see what is worth reclaiming. But yeah, I would love to kind of hear what people, towards the end of this, what films do you want to reclaim? What do you think you can see yourself in? Or do you completely disagree? Is Sleepaway Camp unsalvageable? What is important here is that a lie has permeated trans film history. And when I first started doing this research, I really focused on the lie of Ed Gein, that this was a lie told in the 1950s that lingers to today. But I think my thoughts on that have changed. A lie has permeated trans film history, but it is a lie told time and time again. Every time filmmakers have chosen to conflate transness with murder, using the movability of gender as this ideas of deception or motivation for killing, they've chosen to tell the same lie. It is a lie repeated. So what we're going to do now is I'm kind of just going to give you a bit of an indicator on the structure of what we're going to be doing from here on out. This is broken up into parts, and this is kind of our first introduction. And we're now just going to do a little writing prompt. So if you have pen and paper nearby, if you have your phone, or basically any way of writing via laptop, what we're going to do is we're just going to take 3 minutes at the end of each part, and we're going to just do a little creative exercise. So our first one is, I want you to think of the first time you saw a trans villain or a queer villain on screen. You know, if you're stuck for thinking, you know, if you can't think of a trans killer right now, maybe it's Scar from The Lion King, maybe it's Ursula from The Little Mermaid. You know, there's queer villains throughout film history. And I just want you to think on how you felt. How do you feel about it now? Just for 3 minutes in whatever form you want, prose, poetry, free write, mind map, you know, just focus on your thoughts and feelings about that character. So we're just gonna do that. I will also be doing it. And just check out for 3 minutes, and we'll start again in 3 minutes time. So we're now going to kind of just be focusing on our first case study, a 20th century example of trans killers. I picked Sleepaway Camp because it's just a great example of how trans killers are treated by both the narrative and the camera. And it's a great example of the sort of trans rage we can reclaim in these stories. This is where we'll kind of most significantly be discussing child abuse, so I just want to flag that up here. So Sleepaway Camp was directed by Robert Hiltzik and released in 1983, and it is pretty much a paint-by-numbers slasher. It's set at a summer camp where an awful tragedy happened 8 years ago. A father and his twin children, Angela and Peter, are in a boating accident, and only Angela survives. 8 years later, Angela attends the Camp Arawak, and murders start happening. It's a classic kind of Friday the 13th rip-off, very much from the time. There's some good prosthetics, it's got some good kills, but other than that, I think there would be no reason to watch this film if it wasn't for its conclusion. Because it's in the final scene, it is revealed that it was Peter, not Angela, who survived the boat accident. After his father and sister's death, he was sent to live with his auntie, who forced him to live as a girl. Forced him to live as his sister Angela. And it is this trans character, Angela / Peter, who is the killer. The twist, kind of the idea I think that they're going for, is that the unassuming virginal character, who would typically be the final girl in these sorts of narratives, is the killer. I will be using Angela and she, her pronouns for the character, as we'll kind of talk about as we go. So that it's revealed in just a weird and an awful way. At the end of the film, Angela is seen naked, growling like an animal, and she's holding the decapitated head of her lover, her boyfriend, I should say. And it's just weird. This is not a way in which Angela has acted any other time in the film. Like, even when we've seen the killer, you know, lurking in the shadows, there was never like animalistic growling or anything. It's really strange. And obviously in her nudity, we see her with a penis. For this shot, Hiltzik revealed years later, a college-aged man was used wearing an Angela mask, which very much shows the kind of ideas of what they're going for with the trans body, that it is more advanced. Like, it's, you know, you can see quite clearly the masculinity. One of the final lines of the film, which is just brilliant, is one of the camp counselors says, "How can it be? She's a boy." Ignoring the fact that she's holding a decapitated head, like, I think that would probably be a greater worry in that moment. And then the film ends there, and that's what's mad about it. Because if this is a paint-by-numbers slasher, then we need a confrontation with the killer. We need to see a fight, some way of resolution. You know, the horror films are, especially slashers of this period, they do quite like their final girl showdowns, and we don't have one. There is absolutely no resolution to this plot. And I think the obvious answer is the film ends there, because what else do you need to know? I love this quote from Joe Velez, who says, "Queerness is a means to an end, and boy, the ending of Sleepaway Camp sure is mean." It is not a nice scene. It is a horrible, horrible scene, and it lingers in film history almost as much as Norman Bates does. I want to take a step back and just kind of unpack Angela's identity, because it's a melting pot of queerphobic ideas. It is very much a reveal steeped in transphobia, obviously. The idea that adults force children to be trans is just a very popular transphobic rhetoric. I think it's really interesting, the performance that the actress who plays Angela's auntie does, because it's so hyper feminine. It feels like gender play. It's kind of camp in a way that the rest of the film isn't. So much so that it's led to some beliefs that she's actually the lover of Angela's dad in drag. Like, there is definitely a drag-like performance here, and it's fascinating. It is really, it's a strange scene. She's only in one scene, and you know, the fact that she is this villain, the one who's forced this situation. It's all very queerphobic ideas, you know, like it's horrible. And then there's also a sprinkling of homophobia, because the film heavily implies that Angela has gender confusion as a result of seeing her dad with another man at an early age. It's all scattered armchair psychology, you know, entrenched in queerphobia. It's think of the children rhetoric. But I also want to take a step back and say that I love the character of Angela. I think she's brilliant, and there is a reason we're talking about this film years on. I am far from the first person in over 40 years to find an opportunity for reclamation in Angela's story. There's a beautiful essay by Viet Din, and It Came from the Closet. And the trans horror writer Logan Ashley Kisner has also talked about Sleepaway Camp and reclaiming it. I have a bibliography that will be sent to Transmuted, and you can kind of find all this stuff there. This is a film that has fascinated queers for the 40 years since its release. And there's two readings of Trans Rage that I really want to highlight. First off, that Angela is a trans girl. Despite being forced to live as a girl, there seems to be no hint that she doesn't want to. Like, she very much seems to want to be a girl. She's bullied quite a lot by other girls and boys at the camp. But there doesn't seem to be any part of her that, you know, doesn't want to be a girl. Her displeasure comes from how people treat her, how people bully her. She lives the life of a young girl at camp. She tries dating, she tries to find her place, she puts up with bullying. And I find it really interesting in Sleepaway Camp how toxic gender norms run rampant. That kind of a lot of the girls slut shame and virgin shame each other, and the boys are just a flood with toxic masculinity. And it's really interesting, this idea that sleepaway camps and summer camps in general are places where gender becomes codified. That there are boys and there are girls, and there's a lot of imagery across sleepaway camp that divides the kind of male characters on one side of the screen and the female characters on the other. And Angela will often kind of jump between the two. And it's really important to point out kind of who Angela kills in this film. Her first victim is a serial child sex offender who tries to assault her. Other victims include people who bully her for weeks, and her final victim is her love interest, who regularly pressures her into being physical when she is not comfortable. So the director, Robert Hotzig, said, "If you think about it, she is a champion for the abused." And while I do not believe that was his intention when making this film, I do think it is an interesting reading of Angela, that she goes through so much before she becomes a killer. As Viet Dim writes, Angela is the representative of queer rage, a fire that consumes all before it. Her rage at the end of the film can be read as the rage of a trans woman whom cisgenderism has tried to eat away at, until she has responded with a burning, all-consuming rage. And an alternate reading, a less popular one, but one I think is equally as interesting and valid, is that Angela is the pain of a trans man. If you do believe that she has discomfort in living as a girl and being forced to be a girl, then Angela's rage can definitely be a trans masculine rage. Of a boy forced to live as a girl and what constant suppression can build into. Whatever rage Angela has, it is a fundamentally trans rage. Let's go back to that final scene. To understand it, we kind of have to come up with an understanding of how the cisgender gaze on film functions. This is kind of quite an underexplored topic, and I would like way more research to be done into this because it's really important in how we are represented on screen. But so I've kind of come up with this definition of the cisgender gaze as a gaze that treats transgender characters with a to-be-lookedness that is simultaneously preoccupied with clocking, the idea of identifying people as trans. And I think it ties to this kind of quote from Sean Fay in the transgender issue, in which she writes, when someone learns a person is trans, their first instinct is usually to ask details about that person's surgical status. This continues a long tradition of sensationalist, degrading exhibition of trans people as medical freaks. I think the cisgender gaze on film is the cinematic equivalent of that idea of asking what is the surgical status is. It's really important here to remember that Angela's first victim is a man who tries to sexually assault her, a grown man, who in his first scene refers to the children at the camp as baldies, and he is punished, and the film correctly identifies a predatory gaze and criticizes it and has Angela and actors rage against it. But then in the conclusion, Sleepaway Camp ignores that and just gives that gaze to the audience. Adults who gaze upon cisgender children's bodies are correctly identified as predators, but in this film, it's proposed that those who gaze upon transgender children's bodies are simply an audience. It is a horrid final scene, and we must remember that even when reclaiming this film. This kind of reveal is not unique to Sleepaway Camp. This idea of the trans body as being exposed and reorienting the narrative as a twist that reframes pre-existing plot is very much true of a lot of films of the 20th century. You have quite serious flicks like The Crying Game, and then you have parody films like joke films. Ace Ventura parodied The Crying Game, and Dude, Where's My Car? Usually films in which a trans woman's genitals will be revealed and then men will throw up is typically the joke that exists across the 90s and 2000s. Jack Halberstam in A Queer Time and Place writes that the exposure of a trans character whom the audience has already accepted as male or female causes the audience to reorient themselves in relation to the film's past in order to read the film's present and prepare themselves for the film's future. Trans bodies are reorienters in cinema under the cisgender gaze. They are ways of reorienting the narrative. Sleepaway Camp has quite a few sequels, but they are not really worth talking about. In the first scene of Sleepaway Camp 2, it's revealed by rumors, like it's said that Angela has had gender reassignment surgery, and then her gender is never mentioned again. And that's fascinating because it really shows these ideas of what trans is in people's eyes. It is once the operation has been done, it's not worth talking about anymore. In the absolutely unwatchable Return to Sleepaway Camp, Angela hides in drag as a man, and that's kind of fun, but like that's about as close as we get to gender bending in this series again. It's vital to talk about Sleepaway Camp because it is the crudest, most horrible example of the cisgender gaze. All the politeness is torn away. It demands identification and the film ends when it has it. But there is really something beautiful in there. There's a reason we're still talking about it. And that's because it is of this central character of Angela, who we can definitely reclaim, who we can find beauty and joy. And we can see her as a champion for the oppressed. So now we're just going to do our second writing point. Now we've talked about the cisgender gaze. I want to ask, and this is a big question for 3 minutes, but do you think there can be such a thing as a transgender gaze on cinema? If so, what could that look like? Maybe word cloud, mind map, free write, whatever you feel like, but we're just going to spend 3 minutes now just kind of exploring that for ourselves. So for our next case study, we're going to move into the 21st century. So my research is largely focused on 21st century approach to the trans killer because I think it's kind of been forgotten that this trope persists. It's very much imagined with kind of a Silence of the Lambs, Psycho, but the trans killer continues to this day. I just highlighted a few films here. Freaky is quite a fun slasher with a lot of gender play in. I'd highly recommend that as just quite a camp, fun trans killer. There's Titan, which is quite an interesting film that I don't always love, but it's got a lot going on, which follows a killer who it was assigned female birth, has quite a complex gender identity, does a bunch of murders, and then hides as a man, as a guy who's been missing for 20 years and pretends to be that man. It's quite an interesting to have a trans mask killer. It exists in the 20th century, but not very much. And then there's films like Possessor, which are like horror films that have a lot of gender play in them and gender queerness, that has a body hopping assassin in its center who has a lot of identification with the bodies in which they enter. That's another one I would probably quite recommend, but I think the most fun is probably Freaky. What I want to focus on today is the 2008 film Let the Right One In, directed by Thomas O'Fredson. Because of what I can tell is about the modern trans killer, and it's a great comparison to Sleepaway Camp and how this kind of figure of the trans killer child has continued into the 21st century. It's worth noting that in the 21st century, the trans killer's quite often a protagonist now, more so than an antagonist. If we just go back a second, in Titan and Possessor, both of those trans killers are the protagonist of the story, which is an interesting twist in comparison to the kind of 20th century, very much end of the film reveal of the killer. Let the Right One In is a Swedish film based on the 2004 novel by John Ajvide Lindqvist. We'll be focusing mostly on the film. It's set in a Stockholm suburb and follows Oscar, an alienated and bullied 12-year-old boy who befriends Ellie, the mysterious girl next door. Ellie is a vampire, she is hundreds of years old, and she is a trans girl. As the bodies start piling up, the people of the town start to notice that there's something amiss with this girl and take it upon themselves to get rid of her. Meanwhile, the friendship between Ellie and Oscar blossoms, and she encourages him to fight back against his bullies. So we're just going to unpack Ellie's gender for a second. The novel positions Ellie very much as a genderqueer type person. In the novel, he uses he, him pronouns, that's his preferred, but his gender identity is clearly quite complex. And I definitely really kind of got a non-binary reading to the novels, Ellie. Whereas the film, very much trans feminine. I think that's very much what this film is going for. In both stories, Ellie is castrated. The novel explains how and why and has flashbacks to show that, whereas the film does not. It's a film about passing in a really interesting way. Passing as a human and passing as cisgender become intertwined. You know, the trans killer is often passing to deceive and to be a threat, which is obviously very different from why passing is important to a lot of trans people in the world today, which was safety and affirmation. Yeah, whereas here, you know, her past allows her to be a threat to this community. When the film begins, her past is already failing. There's a man who gets blood for her, and he is becoming far worse at it. And so Ellie is forced out into the world herself, and that's when she starts to fail because she's not very good at it. She starts killing people. People become aware that she is. Sorry, 1 second. Become aware that she is a vampire or a threat to this community, and they take upon themselves to rid themselves of her. What's important to note here is that Ellie is quite different from Angela. While there is a beautiful trans portrayal here, she is not an avenger in the same way that Angela is. She is a threat. She is a vampire. She is a monster descending upon this community, and that makes for a very different type of trans killer. And yet, she is also one of the most sensitive trans killers I have ever seen. Over the course of the film, Ellie slowly lets Oscar in on her past and the complexities of her identity. There's a scene when they first start hanging out in which Ellie and Oscar go out together, and she can't consume food, but she tries anyway. She eats a sweet to kind of perform this idea of being human. And shortly after, she throws it up, and Oscar finds her throwing up. And it's such a tender scene about trying to perform to an idea, not letting someone in on who you are completely, and having them see that. In this scene, she says to him, "If I wasn't a girl, would you like me anyway?" To which he replies, "I suppose so." She has these phrases that allude to her coming out without ever fully coming out. And obviously that quote alludes to her vampirism as much as her gender. Inviting a person beyond the past in Let the Right One In is shown as a gradual and intimate process. Later on in the film, she directly tells Oscar, "I am not a girl." I don't think this is a reading of her as not a trans woman. It is about her letting him in on the past, on the confusing nature of being trans and hiding that from people, and how you navigate through the world with that. It's all these intertwining of different passes that makes this film so interesting and so sensitive in its portrayal of its central character. Oh, too bright. I thought that would help. And what's important here is we see kind of a very central idea of violence and exposure and trans, and it's all intertwined. The narrative of Ellie gradually coming out is intertwined with her downfall within this community and the failure of her past. She is hunted and she is forced to flee, and Oscar and her flee their suburb at the end of the film. They must do this as violence besieges them, as a vampire hunter comes after her and has Ellie and Oscar enact violence in retaliation upon the community. Jack Halberstam writes that violence is almost an inevitable outcome when the gender-ambiguous subject inspires not disgust, but desire. And it often becomes necessary for the transgender character to disappear in order to remain viable. Let the Right One In, as we can see from kind of Halberstam's quotes from over 20 years ago, we get a lot of ideas of how trans people exist in cinema, in violence and passing and the destruction of the past and disappearing in order to remain viable. It's very much the bones of how trans people have kind of always been represented in cinema, particularly trans killers. And yet there's a softness throughout, a sensitivity that goes far beyond what has been done before. And if I'm being honest, since. Ellie is such a beautifully soft character. Her passing is portrayed with just complexity in a way that just is so rare. She is morally reprehensible, but she is still a person. We invited to understand her, to let her in. And it is so much more than we ever see from moral trans people in fiction. And yet we must talk about that one scene towards the end, the one scene that is remarkably close to the ending of Sleepaway Camp. There's a scene where Ellie goes into another room to undress, and Oscar peers into the room and guides the audience gaze towards her genitals. It is at this moment that we see her castration scars. They dominate the screen. Similar to Sleepaway Camp, an implied adult audience gazes upon a child's crotch to inform them of the truth of the character, of the gender, of the sex, of the complexity of their identity. In the same way that Angela's body marks a narrative resolution, so does Ellie's. And we get that idea of temporal reorientation again. This moment is meant to make the audience look back at the line where it says, "I am not a girl." And it's supposed to make you go, "Oh, that's why that," yeah. The exposed trans body is narrative resolution. What's really interesting here is that this is not how it happens in the book. In the book, Ellie chooses to show Oscar his body and go, "This is how I am, this is my form." That consent has been removed from Ellie here. in a scene a couple of minutes later, we discover that Ellie wrote a note before Oscar looked in that says, "Please don't come in." Her lack of consent is made explicit to Oscar, to the audience, and yet it is still seen. The cisgender gaze on film is so often a violation, and it does not matter on the age of the character. I think this really shows us how the trans people are treated on screen because of the trans killer element. Because we are seen as a threat, we are also seen as bodies whose consent does not matter. The first part is used to justify the second. And that is the horrible part of this. The trans killer is an interesting figure, but they are constantly chased by this gaze that objectifies, that treats them as without consent. I want to very briefly focus on the very dull American remake of Let the Right One In, Let Me In, which was released in 2010 and is basically shot for shot the same movie. Except Abby, who's Ellie's equivalent in the film, is not trans. The same phrases are still there. Would you still like me if I wasn't a girl? I am not a girl. But in this adaptation, it feels more like she's just saying that because she's a vampire and not for anything else. And a huge part of this is because Let Me In doesn't show the castration scene. It's the only significant difference between the two films. And in response to an asked about this, like, well, Ellie and Abby's complex gender identity, director Matt Reeves says, there isn't anything in Let Me In that is going to change that interpretation. And he is right. Just because we don't see the castration scars doesn't mean they're not there. It doesn't mean that Abby is not trans. But without knowledge of the original text, as the book or the original film, no one would leave that film thinking that she was trans. It's an interesting idea here that the language of revealing that a person is trans on screen is one of exposure. The creative team behind Let Me In chose to remove that scene, but they didn't choose to convey transness through any other way. Because in a system predicated on cisgenderism and its gaze, the language for presenting transness on screen is one of exposure. We're now going to take a step back and do our third writing prompt. In response to that, I want us to brainstorm ways in which a character could convey that they are trans in a film. Imagine a language outside that of exposure. A simple way, cast a trans actor. But what else can we imagine for showing on screen that a person is trans? Again, we're going to take 3 minutes on that and then come back in that time. The trans killer trope isn't going anywhere, as evidenced by his prominence over the last few years. Amelia Perez is the story of a Mexican gangster who transitions either because she wants to or to escape the law, depending on your reading of the film. I don't hate that premise. I think that could have been a really interesting reflection on the legacy of transness on screen, on the trans killer. I was quite excited when this film, started to make waves, but it's just not very good. It's really bad. Many people beyond myself would have spoken extensively about how rife it is with transphobia and racism, and I'd highly recommend seeking out maybe commentators like Jesse Gender has quite a good breakdown of it. This is the most nominated film at both the 2025 Golden Globes and the Oscars. There's 13 nominations at the Oscars, and it's a trans killer film. It's really nice of this film to make my research relevant again. If I started breaking down all the ways this film was a fascinating evolution of the trans killer trope, we would be here all day. All of kind of Jack Halberstam's observations that we've seen throughout the workshop, they map almost exactly onto this film 20 years after he was writing. It is a narrative of cisgenderism and its gaze. It is obsessed with binaries and transition and passing, but it's never concerned with its trans character as a person. It is a spectacularly dull film. 23 years after The Silence of the Lambs won Best Picture, Amelia Perez proves that there's still this cisgender fascination with the spectre of the trans killer. And the only substantial change in how they've chosen to tell these stories is they've chosen to hire trans actors. We also have what I like to call the moderate trans killer. And this is probably my favorite version of the modern trans killer that we're seeing today, but there's still a long way to go. You have characters like Maestro in Doctor Who last year, who was a non-binary god of music, who is very much a trans killer. In their first scene, they correct a person on their pronouns and then kill them. It is beautifully trans in a very interesting way. And in Star Trek Strange New Worlds in 2022, we had the figure of Dr. Angel, who was a non-binary pirate, played by a non-binary actor, who manipulates Spock and steals the Enterprise. Very cool. I really love this interview with the actor who played them. They said, "Let me be a villain. It's not my character's queerness or their transness that makes them a villain. It's love. The real villain of the story is love." And I think robbing trans people of the experiences that we give cis characters is a disservice to the community. That is not activism. And I agree, trans actors playing trans villains is awesome, and I want so much more of that. However, I call these moderate because they're not really too threatening, either in their transness or in their killing. They're more like camp villains. Their transness is present, but I would also say it's quite unobtrusive. They're too moderate to ever fully grapple with transness, with the rage of transness, which is kind of what I want to see more of. And then we have the one that I'm most worried about or most interested in, which Ryan Murphy's Monster series. You will have seen these around, almost certainly. There's the Jeffrey Dahmer one, and then the Hernandez brothers. Is it? It's an anthology Netflix series in which he adapts like narrativizes a different serial killer each season. And later this year or early next year, the third season will be coming out, and it will focus on Ed Gein, who they call the original monster. Now, in his work as a producer, Ryan Murphy has had some great moments, some low moments, and kind of wildly inconsistent in the sensitivity in which he approaches representations of marginalized groups. You know, he can often be quite sensationalist. I do not know if this adaptation will lean into the misattributed transness of Gein. But if transform history has shown anything, it's that when people tell Gein's story, they're mostly interested in this element, in this misattributed transness. I want to just remind you what we said about Gein before, that there were so many lies about his actions that it's difficult to sift fact from fiction. Well, it is up to the creators who tell his story to decide if they are willing to sift fact from fiction. And over the last few months, I have just found these brilliant films that I highly recommend you all check out by the director of Alice Mayo McKay. She is 20 years old. She is a trans girl, and she has made 5 feature films already. It's quite remarkable. Carnage for Christmas is quite a fun slasher, kind of like a mystery whodunit. That's a lot of fun. T-Blockers is about a zombie outbreak that turns bigots, transphobes, and chasers into zombies, and a bunch of trans and queer people have to fight back and kill them. And then there's Satanic Panic, which is kind of like an Evil Dead riff. It's such a fascinating evolution of the trans killer trope. Like, I don't even want to spoil it here. I would recommend you check it out. There is a character who is either a trans killer or almost the exact opposite of a trans killer. McKay's films are brilliant. They are rough around the edges. They really are grassroots filmmaking, and they're full of rage and transness and complex queer characters. They're flawed films, but when I watch them, I feel as though I'm looking at the future of trans cinema. You know, we have trans creators telling trans horror stories today, and that's brilliant. That's the answer to this. That's the answer to what we can do with the figure of the trans killer. As trans people tell these stories of rage and anger. That brings me to the question, I guess the question that haunts this entire workshop, which is what next? You know, the trans killer has been there and they are here, but where do we go from here? Transphobia has dominated depictions of trans people in horror film history. It's horrid, but I hope we also see a potential in the past. the places in which we can extract a cinematic language for our own rage, our own emotions. It's important that we understand where the trans killer came from in order to understand how cisgenderism others us. There's a cinematic history that treats us as monsters and other peoples, and we must understand that past in order to understand the future. But there's also a complexity. I have a deep love for this trope because the trans killer film also contains the seeds of how we can talk about our own emotions, our own rage. You have the trans person scorned in Sleepaway Camp, or you have how difficult it is to wrestle with passing and feeling monstrous and let the right one in. These two characters are so similar and so different, Angela and Ellie. They are children who are treated horribly by the films they are within, but underneath all that, they have this beautiful complexity. You know, even though they are evil and they are threats and they're monstrous, they're complex. On screen, they are trans and they are full of emotions. They're full of rage. And cis people get movies about rage all the time. There are so many films about angry men on the edge doing angry men things. Or you have like good for hair movies about women striking back against oppressors. And what I advocate for is that we need that for trans people. In these difficult times with the far right and transphobia on the rise, we need a narrative language for our rage. I am not advocating that we go out and act like Angela and Ellie. Please do not go out and act like Angela and Ellie. But I am advocating for an outlet for our rage in fiction. And don't characters like Ellie and Angela have a good reason to rage? For Angela, for all the people who treat her horribly, and for Ellie, for the situation she is in, for how she has to survive. And both of them should rage against the films they are in. We're now going to do our final writing prompt, and I suggest you free write this prompt. Just let it spill out of you. In whatever form that works for you, please do it. And that prompt is rage. We'll check back in 3 minutes. And now, just before we kind of wrap up this part of the workshop, I would just like to read a little extract from a piece I wrote last year about Sleepaway Camp. Angela is more than they could ever write her. The film ends here because it must, because if it kept going, she would come for all the other characters, and then she would come for the camera, and then the creators, and then she would come for you, because how dare you look at her like that, a trans child. The film has to end there, because it is all it can do to contain her. This film hates us. I want to take it and I want to show it what it missed. That it tried to make us into a shock, a scare, a twist, and yet despite all its efforts, it couldn't stop us from being human. Trans rage is a fire that cannot stop burning. Trans rage is trans life, and you cannot contain either by ending a movie on your terms. It's about time the movie ended on ours. Thank you very much for coming to this workshop.